A single policy document from Beijing just triggered panic across Tokyo's financial markets. Japan's car factories, chip makers, and defense contractors are now staring down a terrifying deadline 2 to 3 months before their production lines go dark. This isn't a trade dispute, this is economic warfare, and Japan might have already lost. On a cold January morning, China's Ministry of Commerce published a notice that would send shockwaves through one of the world's most advanced economies. The date was January 6th, and the message was devastatingly simple. Exports of dual-use goods to Japan were now under severe restrictions. Dual-use items sound technical, almost bureaucratic. But here's what they really mean: anything that can serve both everyday industries and military applications. We're talking about machinery that builds your smartphone, components that power electric vehicles, raw materials that make radar systems function, and most critically, rare earth elements that hold together nearly every piece of modern technology Japan produces. For a country built on precision manufacturing and technological excellence, this was nothing short of an existential threat. Within hours, analysts inside Japan's industrial corridors began running the numbers. What they discovered was chilling. If alternative supplies of rare earths and strategic materials couldn't be secured within 60 to 90 days, entire sectors would collapse. Electric motor production, semiconductor fabrication equipment, ultra-precision machinery used in everything from medical devices to aerospace, defense electronics that protect national security, radar technology critical for aviation and maritime operations. The potential financial devastation? An estimated 660 billion yen. But the real cost goes far beyond any single figure. This is about the unraveling of an economic model that took decades to build. To understand why China's move is so devastating, you need to understand what makes Japan's economy tick. This isn't a nation blessed with oil fields or vast mineral deposits. Japan's wealth comes from something far more delicate, an extraordinarily sophisticated manufacturing ecosystem that transforms imported raw materials into some of the world's most advanced products. Walk through any Japanese factory floor, and you'll see the result of generations of engineering obsession. Precision robotics assembling car engines with tolerances measured in micrometers. Semiconductor equipment so advanced that only a handful of companies worldwide can produce it. Industrial machinery that other manufacturers depend on to build their own factories. But here's the catch. All of this technological brilliance rests on a foundation of materials Japan doesn't have. Spread across more than 6,800 islands, Japan's confirmed rare earth reserves total just 50,000 tons. That's less than 1% of global deposits. The concentrations are low, scattered across difficult terrain, and economically impossible to mine at any meaningful scale. For a country that consumes rare earths by the thousands of tons annually, domestic production was never a realistic option. So Japan did what it had to do. It imported. And for decades, one country filled that void almost entirely. By 2010, more than 90% of Japan's rare earth supplies flowed from Chinese mines and processing facilities. The relationship seemed stable, mutually beneficial even. China had the resources. Japan had the technology and capital to put them to use. Trade continued smoothly, supporting hundreds of billions of dollars in economic activity. Then came September 2010. A Chinese fishing vessel and a Japanese Coast Guard patrol boat collided near a cluster of disputed islands. The incident itself was minor, the kind of maritime confrontation that happens regularly in contested waters. But what followed was anything but routine. Japanese authorities detained the fishing boat's captain and announced plans to prosecute him under Japanese law. From Beijing's perspective, this was unacceptable. The islands in question, known as Diaoyu in China and Senkaku in Japan, were considered Chinese territory. Detaining a Chinese citizen there wasn't just a legal matter. It was a challenge to sovereignty itself. China's response didn't come through diplomatic channels or international tribunals. It came through the supply chain. Without issuing a formal ban, Chinese authorities tightened export quotas on rare earths. Approval processes slowed to a crawl. Shipments that normally cleared customs in days were held up for weeks. And for roughly 7 weeks, Japan's access to critical materials virtually disappeared. The impact was immediate and brutal. Production lines went silent. Factories that built hybrid vehicles, couldn't source the permanent magnets needed for electric motors. Battery manufacturers ran out of key compounds. Export orders went unfulfilled. Japan's industrial machine, so efficient under normal conditions, suddenly revealed how fragile it truly was. Faced with mounting economic losses and no viable alternatives, Japan released the detained captain. Several months later, rare earth shipments resumed. The crisis passed, but the lesson was learned. Dependence on a single supplier wasn't just risky. It was a strategic vulnerability that could be exploited at any moment. Japan's government and major corporations understood the stakes. Between 2010 and 2020, enormous effort went into reducing reliance on Chinese rare earths. Diplomatic missions courted suppliers in Vietnam, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. Japanese trading companies poured investment into Australia's Lynas mining project, offering technical expertise, low-interest financing, and long-term purchase agreements. For a time, it seemed to work. By some estimates, China's share of Japan's rare earth imports dropped to around 58%. That was still a majority, but it felt more manageable, less dangerous. Except the numbers were misleading. Japan succeeded in diversifying sources of light, rare earth elements, the more common varieties used in applications like glass polishing and petroleum refining. But heavy rare earths, the materials absolutely critical for high-performance magnets, advanced electronics, and defense systems, remained almost entirely dependent on Chinese supply chains. Why? Because mining rare earths is only the beginning. The real challenge is separation and refining, transforming raw ore into usable compounds. This process is technically complex, environmentally hazardous, and requires specialized expertise that took China decades to develop. Very few countries possess this capability at industrial scale. Fewer still can do it cost-effectively. So even when Japanese companies secured ore from Australia or elsewhere, much of it still traveled to China for processing. The supply chain had been geographically diversified on paper, but the choke point remained exactly where it had always been. Faced with this reality, Japan tried another approach, using less. Engineers redesigned permanent magnet motors to minimize heavy rare earth content. They compensated for weaker materials through clever mechanical design. Ferrite magnets and experimental composites were tested. Software algorithms optimized motor performance to squeeze out efficiency without relying on premium materials. These workarounds kept production going, but they came at a price. Performance degraded, manufacturing costs climbed. Products that once led global markets became slightly less competitive. Japan also invested heavily in recycling, recovering rare earths from discarded electronics and industrial waste. It worked, to an extent. Recycled materials met a portion of domestic demand. But the economics were punishing. Recovering a kilogram of rare earth from recycled sources cost several times more than simply buying it from China. By 2023, after more than a decade of diversification efforts, Japan still imported approximately 7,784 tons of rare earths annually. Of that total, roughly 5,700 tons, nearly 70%, came from China. The harsh truth had become undeniable. China's dominance wasn't just about having mineral deposits. It was about controlling an entire industrial ecosystem that no other country could replicate quickly or affordably. So what changed? Why did China decide to tighten the noose now, in January 2025? The catalyst was a series of public statements from Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. Speaking at multiple forums, Ishiba addressed the hypothetical scenario of Chinese military action against Taiwan. His message was clear. If such action threatened Japan's security, Tokyo would view it as an existential crisis requiring a response. From Beijing's standpoint, this crossed a red line. Taiwan is considered a core national interest, a matter of territorial integrity beyond negotiation. Any suggestion that Japan might intervene militarily or support intervention was unacceptable. Chinese officials issued warnings. Ishiba didn't back down. Instead, he reiterated his position, framing it as a matter of national defense and regional stability. China's response was swift and layered. First came a suspension of Japanese seafood imports, targeting fisheries and coastal economies. Then came the announcement on January 6th, comprehensive restrictions on dual-use exports. But the full scope only became clear when you looked at the details. This wasn't just about rare earths. The ban covered gallium and germanium, critical for semiconductors. It included advanced machine tools, specialized alloys, and over 1,000 categories of industrial products. And it came with a warning. Any third country attempting to re-export Chinese materials to Japan would face legal consequences under Chinese law. Japanese companies were still processing this information when Beijing dropped another bombshell less than 24 hours later. China's Ministry of Commerce launched an anti-dumping investigation into dichloromethane, a chemical solvent imported from Japan. The investigation would last a year, potentially extending to 18 months. Japanese firms were required to cooperate fully or face penalties. 2 major trade actions in 48 hours. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't reactive. It was calculated, coordinated, and designed to inflict maximum pressure. Tokyo's financial markets reacted like a patient receiving a terminal diagnosis. Chemical industry stocks plummeted. Shares of Shin-Etsu Chemical and Mitsui Chemicals, giants of Japan's industrial sector, saw sharp declines. Automotive stocks bled value as investors grasped the implications. Toyota and Honda each lost more than 5% of their market value in a single trading session. The math was simple and terrifying. Without Chinese rare earths, production stops. Without production, revenue disappears. Without revenue, jobs vanish. Behind closed doors, procurement executives were running worst-case scenarios. One anonymously told reporters that roughly 70% of his company's supply orders came from China, and that those orders had been frozen overnight. Production schedules, carefully planned months in advance, were suddenly meaningless. What made it worse was the lack of warning. Many Japanese manufacturers kept rare earth stockpiles sufficient for 2 to 3 months under normal operating conditions. That buffer was designed for minor disruptions, temporary delays. It was never meant to cover a complete supply cutoff. For years, there had been an implicit assumption within Japan's business community. Even if political relations soured, even if diplomatic rhetoric grew heated, trade in essential industrial materials would continue. Economics would override politics. Mutual interest would prevail. That assumption died on January 6th. Japan's response came quickly, but it wasn't what anyone expected. Rather than negotiating or seeking mediation, Japan's Marine Research Agency deployed the Chikyu, a deep-sea exploration vessel, to waters near Minamitorishima, a remote island at the far eastern edge of Japan's territory. The target, rare earth deposits buried 6,000 meters below the ocean surface. Research conducted since 2010 suggested that seabed sediments near Minamitorishima contained rare earth concentrations far exceeding land-based deposits, in some cases by several dozen times. More importantly, these underwater reserves were rich in heavy rare earths, precisely the materials Japan struggles most to secure. On paper, the potential was staggering. Enough rare earths to supply Japan's needs for centuries. Control over a strategic resource within Japan's exclusive economic zone, safe from foreign interference. A permanent solution to decades of vulnerability. But here's the reality. Mining rare earths from 6,000 meters underwater isn't just difficult. It's borderline impossible with current technology. The engineering challenges are immense. Specialized drilling equipment must operate under crushing pressures in complete darkness. Transporting materials from the ocean floor to the surface requires systems that don't yet exist at commercial scale. Even if extraction succeeds, the cost would be astronomical. Analysts estimate that recovering a single ton of deep-sea rare earths could cost more than purchasing several tons on the open market. Then there are the environmental consequences. Deep-sea mining disrupts ecosystems we barely understand. Sediment plumes could spread for hundreds of kilometers, affecting marine life across vast areas. International environmental organizations have already signaled fierce opposition to any large-scale operations. And even if Japan somehow overcame all these obstacles, even if it successfully mined rare earths from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, there's one problem it still can't solve. Processing. Raw rare earth ore is useless without separation and refining. That industrial capability, the know-how to transform minerals into usable compounds, remains overwhelmingly concentrated in China. Japan would still need access to Chinese processing facilities or spend decades building its own from scratch. So here we are. Japan, one of the world's most technologically advanced nations, is facing an industrial crisis it saw coming but couldn't prevent. Despite a decade of diversification, despite billions invested in alternative suppliers, despite experimental deep-sea mining missions, the fundamental equation hasn't changed. China controls the rare earths. China controls the processing. And China has decided to use that control as leverage. The question now isn't whether Japan can escape this dependency. The evidence suggests it can't, at least not quickly, and not without enormous cost. The real question is what happens next. Does Japan capitulate on Taiwan-related rhetoric to restore trade? Does it accelerate efforts to build domestic processing capacity, knowing it will take years and face economic headwinds? Or does it seek new alliances, new frameworks, new technologies that might reshape the balance of power? What's clear is this. The era of assuming economics would override geopolitics is over. Supply chains aren't just business relationships. They're instruments of national power. And when one country controls resources the rest of the world desperately needs, those resources become weapons. Japan's industrial nightmare has only just begun, and the rest of the world is watching nervously, wondering if they're next. If this story showed you how fragile our global economy really is, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the geopolitical forces reshaping our world. Comment below. Do you think Japan can break free from China's rare earth monopoly, or is this dependency permanent? And check out our next video where we explore which countries might be next on China's economic hit list. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.